This week, Ukrainian fighters secured their positional superiority with their tactical maneuvers. The fighters did not turn a blind eye to the invading Russians. Putin is already mired in various political troubles. The failure of Putin's plans on the fronts undermines the confidence of the soldiers in him. Yesterday, we told you about the constant change in the duties of the commanders in the Russian army. This shows that the chain of command among the Russians is not solid. How successful can an army be when management is in trouble? There is a lot of news from the south today. Ukrainian warriors assembled here the most advanced weapons in their arsenal. After that, the warriors carried out a series of deadly attacks. The target of the first blow was Tokmak. Tokmak is one of the largest prefrontal towns. For this reason, Tokmak has become one of the most important logistics centers where the Russians deployed tens of thousands of soldiers and a large number of ammunition depots, equipped warehouses, and command points. Ukrainian fighters today launched a HIMARS attack on Russian military bases on the northwestern outskirts of the town near the old poultry farm. The attack itself did a lot of damage to the Russian camp. The Russian forces thought the attack was over. However, just at this time, Ukrainian fighters carried out the second attack along with longer-range, multiple launch rocket systems. The second attack was even more devastating. The Ukrainians knew that the Russians usually sent large numbers of soldiers to clear the area after an attack, which meant that this would be an excellent opportunity to double the damage. The target of the second attack was Berdyansk. Berdyansk is also one of the largest logistics centers in Russia. This is because Berdyansk has a large port stretching between Melitopol and Mariupol and many industrial areas that can be used to store ammunition and equipment. Ukrainian forces launched multiple Storm Shadow missiles targeting the industrial area. Russian sources claim that the Russians managed to shoot down almost all the missiles. Despite everything, some missiles reached their predetermined destinations. After that, they destroyed the Russian military base and command posts on the territory of the port. However, this was still not the greatest loss for the Russians. Later, Ukrainians also targeted the Dune Hotel in the southeast of the town. However, Ukrainian fighters completely destroyed this hotel. This hotel served as the command headquarters of the 58th Russian Army. Therefore, the Ukrainians eliminated the commander of the Russian Southern Military District, Lieutenant General Oleg Sokov. This was another terrible loss for the Russians. The invaders are being shaken by bigger blows every day. Ukrainian warriors are literally reaping the fruits of their perseverance. Sokov was one of the most experienced generals in the Russian army. He fought in the First and Second Chechen Wars and in Syria. Even Sokov was wounded near the front line in the Luhansk region last year. Sokov was an astute commander-in-chief. Sokov had about 85,000 soldiers at his disposal. Other sources state that Sokov was not alone in the headquarters and that the strike likely eliminated division and brigade commanders as well. A few days ago, we said that the Russian army had lost another high commander. The captain of the second rank was killed during the normal morning run of Stanislav Rositsky. Ukrainian intelligence stated that an unknown person was waiting for Rositsky near the stadium. This person shot Rositsky 7 times and disappeared. Russian sources complained that the assassination was orchestrated by the Ukrainian secret services. However, the head of Ukrainian intelligence denied these allegations. Rositsky was the commander of the submarine Krasnodar, which launched caliber cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities. As a result, Ukrainian fighters managed to wipe out Russian military camps with HIMARS warriors, thus developed a destructive tactic. In addition, Ukrainian troops carried out a very effective series of Storm Shadow attacks, further reducing the number of skilled Russian commanders. Today, French President Macron approved the shipment of the French Scalp missile, which is the equivalent of even more Storm Shadow missiles. That's why we're definitely going to see a lot more of these types of attacks in the near future. According to local Ukrainian military officials, Russian forces bombed a humanitarian headquarters and residential areas in the city of Kherson. As a result, the invaders injured 5 people. The village of Sofiyivka was attacked with Grad rockets. After that, a civilian died to coincide with the NATO summit. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that the Russian forces advanced 1.5 kilometers near the town of Lyman in the Donetsk region, Shoigu announced. On Russian state television that Russian troops launched a counterattack, moving 1.5 kilometers along 2 kilometers of the front. Pro-Russian sources in this area stated that the armed forces of the Russian Federation advanced along the front in Novoselivka area to a depth of 1 kilometer. Then it was stated by the media that the Russians occupied part of the Kupiansk-Kremenna highway. The Ukrainian General Staff denied the success of Russian attacks in the region, and the General Staff of Ukraine stated that the Ukrainian soldiers are holding their ground. Ukrainian air defense systems were deployed around Kiev early this morning. Russian forces attempted to strike the ports of Odessa on the first day of the NATO summit and before the Black Sea Grain Agreement expired on July 17th. A Kremlin-affiliated military blogger stated that the Ukrainian forces systematically targeted Russian-occupied infrastructure in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, particularly the resting centers used by Russian forces as headquarters and command points. According to the occupation authorities, explosions were heard in the occupied city of Skadovsk yesterday. On the other hand, good news is coming for Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron announced at the NATO summit that France will hand over long-range missiles to Ukraine. Macron did not mention the name of the weapon. However, this weapon is most likely equivalent to the UK's Storm Shadow. It wouldn't be wrong to assume that this new French missile will be the Scalp missile. France has also committed to a $188 million military aid package. The United Kingdom has announced a new $65 million military aid package for Ukraine, including Challenger, 2 munitions and around 70 infantry fighting vehicles. The White House is currently considering providing long-range missiles to Ukraine. Pro-Russian sources said Ukrainian forces had occupied new positions around Khrushchevka in the southwest flank of Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops managed to break into the defense of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. 1.5 kilometers from Rostov-Krasnolika is about 5 kilometers north of Bakhmut. Wherever the Ukrainian fighters go, victory follows them. The political agenda is still mixed today. And again, this mess is not for Putin's sake. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whom Vladimir Putin calls my dear friend, has dealt a series of major blows to the Russian president in just 1 week. We said that Erdogan gave the Azov regiment commanders back to Zelensky. So this is just the beginning. Erdogan urged the North Atlantic Treaty Organization last weekend to expedite Ukraine's application for membership in the military alliance. If Ukraine becomes a member, NATO will defend the country in a war against Russia. Since the invasion began, Finland has joined the alliance, while Erdogan has prevented Sweden from joining the alliance. How will Putin react to Erdogan's support for something that might hinder him? We'll see in the future. Major offensive operations of the armed forces of Ukraine scorched the battlefield. We have reported that the clashes in Zaporizhia will shift towards Donetsk, and the Ukrainians will advance from there to Luhansk. And finally, the expected came true. You know that the Ukrainian forces tried to capture Markivka and reach the Luhansk front lines from the Donetsk region. When we look at the battlefield these days, we notice that the offensive operations towards the Berestov, Zolotarenko and Kremenna lines have increased after the Ukrainian forces captured this city. On the one hand, The Russians are trying to defend the Zaporizhia front lines against the Ukrainian forces. On the other hand, they are struggling not to lose Luhansk, the second stage of Kiev's major offensive operations. But Ukrainians are ready to finish this job on both sides, increasing the offensive operations on the Kremenna front line. The Ukrainian troops continued to target the trenches in the north of this city. In other words, after the Ukrainians captured Markivka, they created an attack corridor of about 120 kilometers from here to state off with the Ukrainian forces creating this long corridor of attack. The Russians had to take a defensive position on many of Luhansk's front lines. Moscow's concern was a possible sudden Ukrainian attack. The Ukrainian armed forces met this expectation of Moscow recently and launched an incredible drone attack on the city of Startov, one of the most critical front lines of Luhansk. The Ukrainian defense forces destroyed the launch pad of Russian drones near the town of Svatov in the Luhansk region. The Russian military base, which was used as the Startov UAV airport, was destroyed as a result of the successful operation of the 92nd Separate Motor Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. The 92nd Separate Motor Brigade used Mavic 3 and Mavic 3 drones supplied by the United 24 Initiative to destroy the Russian military base there. During the offensive operation, the soldiers of the Ukrainian brigade discovered two VSAT antennae near this airbase. Then, as you guessed, the offensive operation began once again. The Ukrainians have used their drone army to neutralize an airbase held by the Russians. It is claimed that as a result of this Ukrainian offensive, Russian soldiers were also destroyed because there were many Russian UAV operators and soldiers in this airbase used by the Russians in Stithof. Therefore, it is thought that Russian losses are not limited to military equipment only. Artem Lasutu, head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, said that at the moment the situation in the region is quite critical. Such a striking operation in the direction of Startov Kupiansk greatly affected the Russian situation in the Luhansk region. That's because the airbase which the Ukrainian forces targeted with drones was being used by the Russians to launch airstrikes on the Luhansk front lines. Before continuing our video, I would like to remind you again, if you are against the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work we do with my team, you can like our video and comment and hit the super thanks button below. Therefore, the Ukrainians succeeded in making the Luhansk airspace much more secure by neutralizing this airbase in Stuthof, which the Russians controlled. In addition, with the progress of the Russians and Ukrainians in Luhansk, the possibility of sending military shipments and reinforcements to this region from their own border lines decreased. As you know, the presence of Free Legion groups fighting for Kiev on the Russian border lines is another obstacle for Moscow. In other words, the Russian army is experiencing a blockade from both the Ukrainian and Russian border lines, Luhansk and the Donetsk region. In addition, when the events in Zaporizhia are added to this situation, the maneuverability and dominance areas of the Russian army narrows considerably. Already many in the West expect Ukraine to achieve meaningful success from the start, thanks to substantial NATO training and weapons. While it is too early to declare the success or failure of the operation planned by Kiev, early signs indicate that alarm bells are ringing for the Russians. So what measures is Russia currently taking against this successful advance of the Ukrainian army? Of course, there were always Moscow's thoughts of retaliation against Kiev's offensive plans. But right now, the Moscow administration does not seem to have many options to stop this advance of Kiev. The Russians are currently building only defensive fortifications as a precaution on the front lines, stretching as far as Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. But it is noteworthy that the defense structures that Russia built are almost word-for-word identical to the defense doctrine practiced by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In fact, the Soviets used the concept of defense to repel an attack by superior enemy forces, to prevent heavy losses, to hold important areas of land, and to create the conditions for a decisive offensive. But the defensive performances currently conducted by the Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine in no way reflect this doctrine. The first area opposite the attack verse is the security zone. The task of the Russians here is to stall the Ukrainian army, to deceive them about the exact location of the real defense, to weaken the aggressors as much as possible. But we do not see an example that supports this, neither in Luhansk nor in Zaporizhia. Although Russia continues to build fortifications in these two regions, these efforts are insufficient to establish the main line of defense. Based on an analysis of the known belts in Russia's main defense zone, these fortifications are likely to have multiple bands of strongpoints, barriers with dragon's teeth and minefields throughout, almost certainly within and between these generations. Russia will try to divert Ukrainian tanks and armored personnel carriers to known location. The Russians would then maneuver to hit them from the flank with direct fire from tanks and anti-tanks. It is also said that the Russians are hiding mobile armored units, probably up to battalion size, on the front lines of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. These units have not yet been deployed to the field. In fact, this situation is risky for Ukrainians. Although Ukraine made significant progress in opening the Orikhiv sector in the Russian security zone within 3 days, the Ukrainian army lost a lot of mine clearance equipment in these areas over time. The minefields that the Ukrainians encountered in their primary defense areas are likely to be much denser and covered with fire. It is therefore unclear how Ukraine can penetrate multiple defense zones with current strength levels, as there are fewer engineering assets left at the moment for further progress. Kiev must send reinforcements of military equipment both to the front lines in Luhansk and to the deepest areas of Orikhiv and Velika Novosilka in Zaporizhia. As the Ukrainians continue to strive to eliminate this problem, it is likely that President Zelensky will order his troops to look for other points along the line to find a place to break through the first defensive belt. The obvious problem for Moscow is when much of the Russian defense will become a tactical task for the Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, even the Russian lines beyond the first barrier line will come under Ukrainian fire. There is some bad news from the east. After capturing a key village to the south of Bakhmut, the Russians were able to expand control over the region and advance in the area on a hill that would allow them to completely cut off Ukrainian supplies. Luckily, the Ukrainians were prepared for this development and are ready to restructure their defense at any moment. Here, the Russians made several advances. The first axis of attack became the northeastern suburbs. The main Ukrainian fortification in this region is the meat processing plant. The plant is surrounded by a layer of small houses which prevents the Russians from attacking it directly. Expansion to the west is not viable because that would require the Russians to cross the river in the middle of a field and then storm Ukrainian positions in the industrial zone across the railways. That is why the main goal of the Russians here is to move south and help the Russians who have been struggling to cross the pond in the eastern outskirts for the last 6 months. So far, the fights are still taking place on the outer streets. So there is a long way to go towards the meat processing plant. The second axis of advance became the southern suburbs. As you remember, the Russians recently established control over the last block of the village of Optina. Optina is separate only from the administrative point of view. So de facto divides to the south of Bakhmut continue, and no big changes or breakthroughs happened here. The most important developments happened to the southwest of Bakhmut. While the capture of Optina did not give the Russians any tactical advantage, the capture of Kievsk opened access to a lot of possibilities. The Russians immediately moved into directions Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. As of now, the Russians have already cleared the forest, and today the first clashes took place in the rural zone north of the forest. There are a lot of small houses here, which means that there is a possibility of maintaining a permanent presence in this region. And if the Russians achieve it, they will establish physical control over the road that connects Ivanovsky and Bakhmut. But this is not the worst thing. As you remember, the Ukrainians were not using this road anyways because it was too close to the front line, and there are other safer roads. The worst result of establishing control over this rural area is that the Russians will have all other Ukrainian roads in the bag in direct vision. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that this rural area is located on a hill, while the last Ukrainian supply road is in the lowlands and is only 3 kilometers away from it. The good news is that taking control over this region is not as easy, as there are a lot of powerful Ukrainian positions around, which makes it very easy to push the Russians back. The Russians would need to penetrate all Ukrainian positions south of Bakhmut by around 1 kilometer and simultaneously storm Ivanovsky in order to secure this position. The Ukrainians understand the importance of this position, and so far they did not allow the Russians to even enter it. And even if the Russians start to really push here, there is still a number of adjustments that the Ukrainians could make. The first thing the Ukrainians will likely do in case of an increased threat is adjusted their defense. In my estimation, the first step would be to leave the eastern part of Bakhmut. By doing this, the Ukrainians would achieve three things. Firstly, the Ukrainians would shorten the front line from 12 kilometers to 9 kilometers, meaning that the demand for troops and supplies may drop by 25%. Secondly, this move would allow quickly retreating in the case of urgent withdrawal, as all the forces will be on the same bank of the river. Thirdly, the Ukrainians will move from the least fortified positions on the outskirts to the most fortified positions, such as high-rise buildings, industrial zones, and railway stations. Overall, even though the Russians achieved little to no progress by trying to take Bakhmut in front, the Russians did manage to establish control over less fortified positions around Bakhmut, which threatens to cut off Ukrainian supplies. Such developments are not surprising, as the area to the south of Bakhmut is too vast, allowing the Russians to attack sparsely located villages one by one, and however well fortified they may have been, constant artillery fire and airstrikes slowly make sure that there is nothing left to defend. As the Institute for the Study of War concludes, the Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut is still a strategically sound effort, because if the Ukrainians abandon such towns' fortresses prematurely, it would force them to construct hasty defensive positions in less favorable terrain. But by deciding to hold the ground, the Ukrainians ensured that their patients have been funneling their manpower and equipment into the area since May 2022 with no operational, let alone strategic success.